Authority. Oop. Fucking hell. Well, you're a bunch of dicks, America, aren't you?
You're so did is it Trump won the popular vote?
Oh, aye.
Apparently.
Jesus.
A lot. I mean, like 10 million plus.
He won the popular vote by 10 million?
Something like that. I was like, he goes,
No,
no,
California is.
maybe. I'm
It
lying,
takes
maybe.
weeks to. It takes weeks to count California.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
Yeah, they're only halfway through.
And why does it take weeks to count California and one night to count Georgia?
Laziness, John.
I don't think it's lazy.
Well, I would assert that the forms themselves are more bureaucratic in California.
I mean,
You know, we have in California, there's a voter's guide that is like 60 pages or something. Really insane.
and what are they?
And it's
Describe.
printed in what,
Well,
10 languages or something.
I can speak to that because I'm in LA and I spent like, geez, I don't even know, well over an hour going through all the stuff I didn't know enough about before I put my vote out on the Monday. But
Bloody hell.
yeah, it took a long time because I want to find, because there's like people running for local judgeships and local politics that I'm not aware of. West Hollywood, I know, but the LA County, not completely. So I had to do a lot of research and just figure out who I was going to vote. But yeah.
Speaking of justice, are you all prepared for Supreme Court Justice Eileen Cannon and maybe Alina Habba?
Oh, God.
Having 5 of the 9 Supreme Court justices
They won't
put
get
there
that
by
far.
Donald Trump?
They won't get that far. The ABA will see to it. The Bar Association will stop them.
Yeah, but still, you will have the majority of the Supreme Court put
But
there
How do
by
they-
Donald Trump.
How would the
ABA,
bar?
how
How
do they
would the
do that?
bar association stop Trump from appointing or nominating her, and then stop the Senate from confirming her?
Well, we'll see.
Could Rudy Giuliani be put on the Supreme Court?
Mhm.
Or,
Attorney General.
Ivanka,
Make
why
him
not?
Attorney General. It doesn't have to be, you don't need to, you can be disbarred and still be the Attorney General of the United States.
Oh my God! This
How are
bar
you still
Attorney
a
General,
country?
felon president. Yeah.
Could be Hulk Hogan. He knows all about justice. After the Peter Thiel assisted trial.
Oh, God, what a joke it's going to be. 4 years of, well, anyway, welcome to This and That. And we took a day off to try to pay attention to an election that was very terrible. It turned out very terribly. So we're back to talking about general intellect, which will be relevant probably sooner than we think now. On Monday, we looked at a kind of introductory text that's generated by the Rosa Luxemburg people, and it describes something that doesn't get widely discussed. That is the operaio, or sort of worker, the operative, or the kind of discussion of certain types of worker movements that have to do with knowledge. And this movement, we could say, a workers' movement, is partially associated with the rise in northern Italy, so-called Third Italy, of industrialization. Similar, it is similar in the sense of thinking about Silicon Valley, et cetera. You think about it as the Third Italy is that sort of the northeastern part of Italy. I mean, it affects all of Italy, but the Tuscany, I guess, and some of the other places were part of this idea of creating smaller, more flexible production organizations, and it changes the nature of work as well as the nature of worker organizing. So, and as a result, you have a kind of parallel political organizations, labor organizations that sort of come up with it at the same time. The idea, of course, is that you have generally smaller work units, more flexible production, and other kinds of things that are part of thinking about by analogy. California is the better analogies because of the proximity of, wineries and Silicon Valley and other kinds of stuff all in the same place, the same kind of climate. Anyway, so I introduced this this text, which is uploaded into Discord about radical thought in Italy. And Paulo Birno and Michael Hart were the editors. It includes a bunch of stuff, but it does have this glossary of concepts, which I think are on the one hand, it can add more jargon to our already problematic discourse. On the other hand, it raises certain questions that are raised in other language discourses on radical politics. That is, in some fields, there is a discussion of constitutive or constitutional, as it were, constitutive power. It is a kind of expression about, it's a phenomenological and an ontological idea. It's an idea that our being is sort of tied up with certain types of activity, and it raises a much more fluid integration of processes, doesn't have sort of over mechanical sort of connections, and yet can be adapted to a variety of practices, critical practices. So constituent power, potere constituente, this term refers to a form of power that continually creates and animates a set of juridical and political frameworks. Its perpetually open processes should be contrasted with the static and closed character of constituted power. So this is open versus closed nature of power, democratizing, of course. The revolutionary dynamic of constituent power is itself the constitution of a republic. When the revolutionary forces are closed down or reined in to a constituted framework, the constituent moment too has passed. For an extended analysis of this concept from Machiavelli through the modern political revolutions, Negri's book on constituent power discusses that. And you could say that Machiavelli is actually thinking about this in networked and dynamic ways. And Machiavelli still is useful. There's Exodo or Exodus. In part, this term refers to the biblical journey of the Jews through the desert to escape the Pharaoh's army. Exodus might be understood better, however, as an extension of the refusal of work to the whole of capitalist social relations as a generalized strategy of refusal or defection. Structures of social command are combated not through direct opposition, but by means of withdrawal. This is the idea of going on strike, right? You withhold your work, your labor. Exodus is thus conceived as an alternative to dialectical forms of politics, where all too often the two antagonists, locked in contradiction, end up resembling each other in a static mirror reflection. That is often what happens in trade unionism, where the people who are in charge of the union and management begin to, they talk the same way, and sometimes they co-opt each other for a variety of reasons. And of course, there is corruption. Dialectical politics constructs negations, but Exodus operates through subtraction. The state will crumble then not by a massive blow to its head, but through a mass withdrawal from its base, evacuating its means of support. It is important, however, that this politics of withdrawal also simultaneously constitute a new society, a new republic. We might conceive this exodus then as an engaged withdrawal or a founding leave-taking, which both refuses this social order and constructs an alternative. Paolo Virno gives an extended analysis of Exodus in his essay in this volume on Virtuosity and Revolution, the Political Theory of Exodus. Another concept that we have talked a little bit about on Monday is general intellect, intelletto generalis. This term is taken from a single reference by Marx. Remember, it's only a one little mention in the Grundrisse. Marx uses the term to refer to the general social knowledge or collective intelligence of a society at any given historical period. Fixed capital, in particular intelligent machines, can thus embody this general intellect as well as humans. This is, where AI can be sort of integrated. Just as collective corporeal power is necessary to complete certain tasks of production, that is, to use a pre-modern idea, is to move the huge stones for the pyramids, so too collective intellectual power is employed directly in production. Furthermore, as information technologies and cybernetic machines have become more important as means of production, general intellect has become increasingly not just a direct force, but the primary force of social production. Another concept in the glossary is mass intellectuality, intellectualita di masso. This term refers to the collective intelligence and accumulated intellectual powers that extend horizontally across society. It does not refer to a specific group or category of the population, such as a new intelligentsia, but rather to an intellectual quality that defines to a greater or lesser degree the entire population. Intellectuality is not a phenomenon limited to the individual or the closed circle of trained intellectuals. It's a mass phenomenon that depends on social accumulation and that proceeds through collective cooperative practices. I like to think that what we do here is that kind of thing, more organic in that context. Gramsci says that all men are intellectual, but not all in society have the function of intellectuals. Today's technico-scientific knowledges and practices are spreading to invest all spheres of life to a greater extent. Capital has learned from Gramsci's insight and put it to work. The post-Fordist workforce produces increasingly, on the basis of its collective intelligence, its mass intellectuality. Power, potere, potenza. The English term power corresponds to two distinct terms in Italian, that is potenza and potere, which roughly correspond to the French puissance and pouvoir, the German Macht and Vermögen, and the Latin potentia and potestas, respectively. So potenza can often resonate with implications of potentiality, as well as with decentralized or mass conceptions of force and strength. Potere, on the other hand, refers to the might or authority of an already structured and centralized capacity, often an institutional apparatus, such as the state. In some cases in this volume, we have translated both terms as power and included the original Italian term in parentheses. In other cases, we have used other terms to avoid confusion, translating potenza, for example, as potentiality or potere as sovereign power. And you can see that there is a subtle semantic difference in something that is fairly close. Some of it has to do with timing. Some of it has to do with kind of location or assimilation. That's, on the one hand, the beauty of certain other languages. Now, immaterial labor, lavoro immateriale, immaterial labor. commodities in capitalist society have come to be less material, that is, more defined by cultural, informational, or knowledge components, or by qualities of service and care. The labor that produces these commodities has also changed in a corresponding way. Immaterial labor might thus be conceived of as the labor that produces the informational, cultural, or affective element of the commodity. One central characteristic of the new forms of labor that this term tries to capture is that the labor is increasingly difficult to quantify in capitalist schemata of valorization. In other words, labor time is more difficult to measure and less distinct from time outside of work. There's a kind of, fluidity of this, I suppose. Not that you're going to, take siesta time or whatever and try and make it count like that, although perhaps you could. Much of the value produced today thus arises from activities outside the production process proper, in the sphere of non-work. For an extended analysis of this concept, see Maurizio Lazzarado's essay on immaterial labor. Refusal of work. Rifiuto di lavoro. The refusal of work was a popular slogan in Italy, beginning with radical workers' groups in the 1960s, and then spreading throughout the social movements of the 1970s. It should be understood principally in opposition to the glorification of work that has permeated some veins of the socialist tradition. Consider Stakhanov, for example, the mythical Soviet miner who did the work of several men for the glory of this country. Well, it's a lot of it is PR, and it's 128 tons of coal dug in a day, which likely is not quite the truth, but there's a whole movement built around this relative to mining, for example. This is during Stalin, during the most pure of the Stalinist period in the late 20s, 30s. For these workers, communism does not mean any sort of liberation of work, but rather a liberation from work. The destruction of capitalism involves also the destruction, not the affirmation of the worker as worker, qua worker. This refusal of work should not be confused with a denial of one's own creative and productive powers. It is a refusal, rather, of the capitalist command that structures the relations of production and binds and distorts those powers. This refusal, then, is also an affirmation of our productive forces or creative capacities outside of capitalist relations of production. Classic source for this concept is Mario Tronti's The Strategy of Refusal, also in the text. And then finally, self-valorization, valorizzazione. That's it. Marx understood capitalist valorization as the process by which capital creates surplus value in the labor process. If the labor process is not carried beyond the point where the value paid by the capitalist for the labor power is replaced by an exact equivalent, it is simply a process of creating value. But if it is continued beyond that point, it becomes a process of valorization. Now, let me break here for a second to remind you that I used an example in valorization of the reuse or adaptation of waste products from a particular natural production process, or whatever mechanical production process. If you produce a waste byproduct that you can actually turn into some other kind of something valuable, that is a kind of valorization, and that's a more common term that has nothing to do with the politics of it. It is simply adaptive reuse or whatever. Surplus labor and the value it creates are thus what define the process of valorization. Valorization can also refer more generally to the entire social structure of value that is grounded in the production and extraction of surplus value. In contrast, self-valorization, which does appear in the Grundrisse, refers to an alternate social structure of value that is founded not on the production of social value, of surplus value, but on the collective needs and desires of the producing community. So there is a kind of social use and exchange value that is associated, a social structure of value that associated with, but not founded on, the production of surplus value. In Italy, this concept has been deployed to describe the practices of local and community-based forms of social organization and welfare that are relatively independent of capitalist relations of production and state control. Self-valorization is also conceived in a more philosophical framework as the social processes that constitute, that word again, an alternative and autonomous collective subjectivity within and against capitalist society. So there's some kind of political activism sort of built into self-valorizing. That is, it is a kind of creative process in that sense, or if you want to press it further, a recreative or recreative process. So chapter 1 of Radical Thought in Italy of Potential Politics by Verno and Hart is, I put the link in, and as I've said, I've uploaded a copy. Hart writes the first chapter to try and explain this all historically, that there are 3 phases, and it's a way of kind of organizing the material in the text. So it's a good introductory chapter. Laboratory Italy refers no longer to a geographical location, but to a virtual space of hope and potential that may be actualized anywhere. Better, it refers to a specific modality now available to all of us of experimenting in revolution. And if you've seen the Godard film, what's it, Tout va bien, sort of implies that can happen. Now, whether it really works or not is a whole different question. During extended periods, many of these authors were theorists on the side and kept political activism as the day job. Althusser was fond of quoting Lenin as saying that without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary practice. These Italians insist more on the converse relation. That is, revolutionary theory can effectively address only questions that are raised in the course of practical struggles. And in turn, this theorizing can be articulated only through its creative implementation on the practical field. The relationship between theory and practice remains an open problematic, a kind of laboratory for testing the effects. Now, remember, on Monday, I was talking about, this idea of the general intellect is partially sort of related to, the necessary knowledge for the development of machine operation and, of course, labor-saving devices. It is, essentially read the effing manual. But it's a lot more than that. The relationship between theory and practice remains an open problematic, a kind of laboratory for testing the effects of new ideas, strategies, and organizations. Revolution can be nothing other than this continually open process of experimentation. Now, that can be good and bad, of course. You can screw up all kinds of machines, going sort of half-assed on, during a production day. A first long season of political struggles extended from the early 1960s to the early 1970s, in which factory workers constituted the epicenter of the social movements. The attention of revolutionary students and intellectuals was focused on the factories, and a significant portion of the militant workers saw the struggle for communism and workers' power as leading through independent political organizations outside of and often opposed to the Communist Party and its trade unions. The most significant radical political theorizing of this period dealt with the emerging autonomy of the working class with respect to capital. That is, its power to generate and sustain social forms and structures of value independent of capitalist relations of production. And similarly, the potential autonomy of social forces from the domination of the state. One of the primary slogans of the movements was the refusal of work, which did not mean a refusal of creative or productive activity, but rather a refusal of work within the established capitalist relations of production. So the implication is, it's a more collective activity, one that has other elements built into it. The anti-capitalism of the worker and student groups translated directly into a generalized opposition to the state, the traditional parties, like the Communist Party, and the institutional trade unions. In other words, in Europe, there are very traditional trade unions that were built up from certain types of processes that were part of the entire production process, with sub-unions, et cetera, et cetera. America has the same kinds of things. The problem is that, there's some sort of work rules can be oppressive if, sort of done without feedback or other kinds of accommodations. So that's kind of the thing that people worry about, similar to the creation of work processes without a union that, like Amazon, you have to bring your jar or bottle to urinate in. A second stage of the movements can be defined roughly by the period. Remember, we talked about the 60s to the early 70s. Now, from 1973 to 1979. These are important years in the sense of, you have a massive OPEC oil shortage crisis and a variety of other things. And this is after the big, some of the big revolts, that, May 1968, et cetera. In general terms, the focus of radical struggles spread in this period out of the factory and into society, not diluted, but intensified. Increasingly, the movement became a form of life. The antagonism between labor and capital that had developed in the closed spaces of the shop floor now invested all forms of social interaction. Students, workers, groups of the unemployed, and other social and cultural forces experimented together in new democratic forms of social organization and political action in horizontal, non-hierarchical networks. The Italian feminist movement gained a significant role during this period, with its activities focused on the referenda on divorce and abortion. This is the period, too, when terrorist groups such as the Red Brigades emerged from the same social terrain. One should not, however, let the dramatic exploits of the terrorist groups, in particular the 1978 kidnapping and assassination of the prominent politician Aldo Moro, eclipse the radical social. It was 55 days of kidnapping. Excuse me. Eclipse the radical social and political developments of a wide range of leftist movements. Across the social spectrum, there were instances of social antagonism and diffuse forms of violence mixed with social and cultural experimentation. The political theory that emerged from these movements sought to formulate alternative democratic notions of power and insisted on the autonomy of the social against the domination of the state and capital. Self-valorization was a principal concept that circulated in the movements, referring to social forms and structures of value that were relatively autonomous from and posed an effective alternative to capitalist circuits of valorization. Self-valorization was thought of as the building block for constructing a new form of sociality, a new society. Now, you can say that, well, this is the 70s and it's like hippies and, whatever, thinking, whatever, counterculture-wise. Yes and no. On the other hand, it is a resistance to certain types of production processes. Beginning at the end of the 1970s, the Italian state conducted an enormous wave of repression. The magistrates sought to group together and prosecute the terrorist groups, along with the entire range of alternative social movements. Kind of what's going to happen soon. Thousands of militants were arrested under extraordinary statutes that allowed for extensive preventative detention without any charges being made against those arrested and without bringing them to trial for extended periods. The courts were given wide powers to obtain convictions merely on the basis of the association of the accused with political groups charged with certain crimes. Large numbers of political activists went into hiding and then into exile, and thus by the early 1980s, the political organization of the social movements was all but destroyed. Most of the contributors to this volume, in fact, lived this period either in prison or in exile. At the same time, Italian capital embarked on a project of restructuring that would finally destroy the power of the industrial working class. The symbolic defeat took place in 1980 at the Fiat auto plant in Turin, which had for decades been a central site of workers' power. Fiat management succeeded in shrinking the workforce, laying off tens of thousands of workers, through the computerization of the production plants. These were the years of winter for the social movements, and the radical political theorizing, too, lived a kind of exile, as if it had gone underground to weather the bleak period. The Italian economy experienced another boom in the 1980s, largely powered by new forms of diffuse and flexible production. Remember, we talked about that, post-Fordist production. This is the same period where fiat, extends into Russia, et cetera. Largely powered by new forms of diffuse and flexible production, such as that characterized by Benetton. Benetton, as a clothing manufacturer, also had a parallel kind of advertising campaign that was, anti-imperialist, anti-globalization, and you may or may not remember that advertising. Quite dynamic. But the social terrain was typified by a new conformism nurtured by opportunism and cynicism. Marx might say that his beloved mole had gone underground, moving with the times through subterranean passages, waiting for the right moment to resurface. All three of these periods, the intense worker militancy of the 60s, the social and cultural experimentation of the 70s, and the repression of the 80s, made Italy exceptional with respect to the other European countries and the United States. Radicals outside of Italy might have admired the audacity and creativity of the social movements and mourned their brutal defeats, but the conditions of Italian revolutionary practice and thought seemed so distant that their lessons could not be applied and adapted to other national situations. I believe, however, that in the 1990s, despite sometimes dramatic and sometimes ludicrous headlines that make Italian politics seem increasingly eccentric, Italian exceptionalism has in fact come to an end, so that now Italian revolutionary thought, as well as reactionary developments, can be recognized as relevant to an increasingly wide portion of the globe in a new and important way. And you kind of see that with the rise of the right wing in Italian politics. The experiments of laboratory Italy are now experiments on the political conditions of an increasing large part of the world. This new convergence of situations might be linked to two general processes. It's due partly, no doubt, to the capitalist project of globalization, in which, in certain sectors throughout the world, capital is moving away from dependence on large-scale industries towards new forms of production that involve more immaterial and cybernetic forms of labor, flexible and precarious networks of employment, and commodities increasingly defined in terms of culture and media. This is the gig economy. As Italy as elsewhere, capital is undergoing the post-modernization of production. That's one way to talk about it. At the same time, on an equally global scale, neoliberal policies imposed when necessary by our friends, the IMF and the World Bank, are forcing the privatization of economic sectors that have been controlled by the state and the dismantling of the structures of social welfare policies. The Reagan and Thatcher governments may have led the way, but the rest of the world is fast catching up. In political and cultural terms, too, the Italian condition is moving toward a convergence with other countries, sometimes in rapid, dramatic leaps. Certainly the cynicism, fear, and opportunism that have recently characterized the culture of the institutional left in Italy are factors that we in the United States have come to know well. One might say that the conditions of Italian politics have become Americanized. Certainly the meteoric rise of the media magnate Silvio Berlusconi as a major political figure in the mid-1990s, emerging from outside and in opposition to traditional political structures, cannot but seem strangely familiar from the perspective of the United States. That's Donald Trump all over, complete with the bunga bunga and, whatever. In a way, Berlusconi combines the political entrepreneurship of a Ross Perot with the media entrepreneurship of a Ted Turner. In any case, it's a small step in the developing form of rule, call it mediocrity, or teleocracy, from a bad actor as president to a media tycoon. Furthermore, the Italian political condition has approached what Frederick Jameson has identified as a defining aspect of U.S. left culture in recent years, that is, the condition of theorizing without movements. This This does not mean that radical theorizing might now take place without reference to political practice. Of course, revolution can be theorized only through interpretation and extension of really existent forces immanent to the social field. It means, rather, that the radical theory is deprived of the coherent movements and the firmly consolidated collective social subjects that once animated the terrain of revolutionary practice. Theorists must now interpret the prerequisites of emergent conditions and the nascent forces of political subjectivities and communities coming to be. In such conditions, political theorizing in general might be forced to take on a more highly philosophical or abstract character to grasp these potentialities. To a certain degree, then, postmodernization of the economic realm and Americanization of social and cultural fields are the two faces of a general convergence. This is why the experiments conducted in laboratory Italy are now experiments of our own future. The convergence of social conditions, reducing the gap of Italian exceptionism, has brought Italy close to us and thus made the essays in this volume relevant for us in a way Italian theorizing could not be before. There remain important differences and accumulated wealth. First of all, there's a communist theorizing bent on the abolition of the state, and the refusal of political representation that we seldom find elsewhere. The refusal of the state also brings with it an attack on hierarchical organizations and party structures, trade unions, and all forms of social organization. Antagonism to the state is the centerpiece of a generalized insubordination. The abolition of the state, however, does not mean anarchy. Outside the constituted power of the state and its mechanisms of representation is a radical and participatory form of democracy, a free association of constitutive social forces, a constituent power. Self-valorization is one way of understanding the circuits that constitute an alternative sociality, autonomous from the control of state or capital. Some of the contributors to this volume outline a project, for example, whereby the social structures of the welfare state might be transformed so that the same functions are supported no longer from above, but now from below as a direct expression of the community. This is suggested partially in like Paulo Freire's work in terms of education. The effort to constitute a community that is democratic and autonomous outside of political representation and hierarchy is a continual project of these theorists. Combined with a radical critique of the state is a sustained focus on the power of labor. Marx agreed with the capitalist economists that labor is the source of all wealth in society, but it is also the source of sociality itself, the material of which all our social relations are woven. Throughout these essays, there are attempts to understand the way that laboring practices have changed in recent years and how these new forms of labor might carry new and greater potentials. New concepts such as immaterial labor, mass intellectuality, and general intellect all try to capture the new forms of cooperation and creativity involved in contemporary social production. A collective production defined by cybernetic, intellectual, and affective social networks. The affirmation of the powers of labor found in the work of these theorists, however, should not be confused with any simple call that we go to work or enjoy our jobs. On the contrary, any affirmation of labor is conditioned first by the refusal of work inherited from the worker movements of the 1960s. Radical workers in Italy, as elsewhere, have always tried to get out of work to subtract themselves from exploitation and the capitalist relation. The social movements translated this into a form of life in the realm of non-work outside the relations of waged labor. In the contemporary essays in this volume, this tendency is theorized in a more general way as a mass defection or exodus, a line of flight from the institutions of the capital state and the relations of waged labor. I think that you see this in the form of some labor actions, industrial actions. That is, if we're just going to do a demonstration today, we're not just going to do a demonstration. We're going to do a march that goes through the entire damn city, and it's going to be a big effing deal. And it's going to shut down the city, at least during this period when we're doing this thing. It's not just simply going out front and yelling. It's actually, spreading this out in the community. I would interpret some types of labor actions like that. The author's affirmation of labor refers then not simply to what we do at work for wages, but rather generally to the entire creative potential of our practical capabilities, or practical capacities. These creative practices across the range of terrains, that is material production, immaterial production, desiring production, affective production, and so forth, are the labor that produces and reproduces society. You know, you could say underlying this relative to workers' movements, one of the sub-elements of this, of course, is the organization of, for example, sex laborers, etc. The seeds of a communist society already exist in the virtual paths that potentially link together this labor in new collective articulations. Perhaps what is perhaps most attractive about these Italian theorists and the movements they grow out of is their joyful character. All too often, leftist cultures have identified a revolutionary life with a narrow path of asceticism, denial, and even resentment. Pretty grim Stalinism. Here, however, the collective pursuit of pleasure is always in the forefront. Revolution is a desiring machine. Perhaps this is why. Although these authors follow many aspects of Marxist work, they seldom develop either the critique of the commodity or the critique of ideology as a major theme. Although certainly important projects, both of these analyses run the risk of falling into a kind of asceticism that would predicate revolutionary struggle on a denial of the pleasures offered by capitalist society. The path we find here, in contrast, involves no such denial, but rather the adoption and appropriation of the pleasures of capitalist society as our own, intensifying them as a shared collective wealth. You can get out your sort of Italian stereotype. This is far from a vision of communism as equally shared poverty, and much less a reference back to pre-capitalist communal forms. Communism, rather, will emerge out of the heart of capitalism as a social form that not only answers the basic human needs of all, but also heightens and intensifies our desires. Corresponding to this focus on joy, there is also permeating the work of these authors a distinctive kind of optimism, which might appear naive to some at first sight. At various points in the 1970s, for example, their writings made it sound as revolution was possible and even imminent. Even during the bleak periods of defeat and political repression, there is still an optimistic reading. In the final essay of this volume, for example, Paolo Birno interprets the counter-revolution of recent years as an inversion and redeployment of revolutionary energies, as if it were the photo-negative of a potential revolution. These authors are continually proposing the impossible as if it were the only reasonable option, but this really has nothing to do with simple optimism or pessimism. It is rather a theoretical choice or a position on the vocation of political theory. In other words, here the tasks of political theory do indeed involve the analyses of the forms of domination and exploitation that plague us. But the first and primary tasks are to identify, affirm, and further the existing instances of social power that allude to a new alternative society, a coming community. The potential revolution is always ready, always imminent in the contemporary social field. Just as these writings are refreshingly free of asceticism, so too are they free of defeatism and claims of victimization. It's our task to translate this revolutionary potential, to make the impossible real in our own context. So there are essays here. They're broken up into 4 groups. Part 1 is, the poisonous culture of the 1980s, the culture of postmodernism, the things that become dominant in the 1990s. It's not to simply talk about the poverty of contemporary political culture, but to look at positive elements that can, bring on a new cultural transformation. And so, there's a lot of fiddling around with this, particularly with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The defeat of the left in the late 20th century are not a result of too much Marxism or communism, but on the contrary, of a failure to redeploy creatively the resources of these traditions. Some of us actually still believe that. The essays in part 2 analyze the economic and social conditions of contemporary capitalist production. And so, it deals with the work of women, the role of women in, sort of the workforce, sort of the migration of production outside of the factory, more diffuse kind of social and anthropological forms, et cetera, and also new immaterial forms of labor. Essays in part 3 are about, political theorizing that's adequate for, a pre-existing political subjectivities. I've said sometimes before anyway. How is it that we practice, certain types of democratic practices? And then there's the essays in the appendix. They're intended as a historical overview to situate and complement the theoretical essays in the rest of the volume, fill the same role as the last part of volume 1 of Capital on primitive accumulation. They detail the historical developments that in one country have laid the conditions for the preceding theoretical analysis of a general situation. In this sense, the appendix may be read profitably before the rest of the volume. Do You Remember Revolution was written in 1983 by 11 authors who were then in prison, including Virno and Negri. And so you have that kind of sense of struggle, as it were. And then there are these unfamiliar concepts, which I introduced earlier. It is, kind of an interesting creative process, sort of trying to work through what is the semantics of that particular kind of thing. And, there's a wealth of revolutionary experience and desire. Laboratory Italy refers no longer to a geographic location, but to a virtual space of hope and potential that may be actualized anywhere. Better, it refers to a specific modality now available to all of us of experimenting in revolution. Yeah, well, some of us get pretty optimistic about this stuff, that it's still possible, despite, the failures of our own federal government. In some ways, it's clearer. You can actually see the madness at work at the top, particularly in the case of Trump. I mean, truly, we're going to see all the same stupidity that we saw in the first Trump term. That is his inability to drink water, his cluelessness in some places, cluelessness about history or culture or appropriateness or just basic, kind of primitive rudeness. We're going to see that. 4 more years of that shit. So anyway, so that's kind of the little thing I wanted to cover today, and I hope this is serves some interesting purpose. Let's take a look at the oh yes, Elon describing rocket landing. I do like that structure. It always seems weird to me, like it's an animation. And then there's that gantry that sort of grabs the rocket. Pretty necessary because, there were these failures of those landings where the damn thing tipped over and blew up. So grabbing the darn, rocket is probably a good idea. Let's see. Trumpian speeches. We're not going to burn books today yet. So there's a Trump speech, and it has Dana White and all those clowns, the other clowns. God, maybe we should watch that instead. Are there questions, comments, interventions, brickbats? Hearing none, I will proceed to shut the live stream off. And thank you for your participation. As I said, this is the second half of the sort of introductory idea about certain concepts related to general intellect. And what it shows is that often it's not a matter of reading a whole bunch of books, but rather getting together with folks and trying to organize practices, things to do, how to do things. And in some cases, particularly in the case of it has a sense of, how Italian culture operates, working later in the evenings, it's a different sort of sense of how the day operates. And so